So I'm Feroz Mohammed. I've been working in projects and programs for well over a decade, waterfall and agile, both as project team member, project leader, project manager, program manager, and I've set up a fair few PMOs in my time as well. So I've been around the block in both UK private sector and public sector, and I've been lucky enough to work in a number of cultures, a number of different working cultures and a number of different working environments, but for various reasons, which I'll come on to, as I'm sure we're all aware, 2020 brought its own unique challenges. I don't come here before you as somebody who's professing to be a particular expert or authority. I don't necessarily regard my word or opinion as greater than anybody else's when it comes to building a culture of safety. But I'm very much on a journey personally and professionally. And hopefully I can share some of that journey and give you some of my thoughts. I was initially resistant to the idea of coming speaking to people about what's happened over the last year or so. But I was eventually convinced by Craig, and having had a conversation with John, that sharing the experience of the last year may well make a positive difference to listeners and their teams. And I'm hoping that that might be the case. And I'd be really keen to get people's feedback, thoughts and contacts after I finish speaking. But I'm going to start, and I'm going to embed and contextualize what happened last year at BT with my own personal journey. Over the course of the next 15, 20 minutes or so, it may well feel like I'm tangenting. It may well feel like I'm wandering well away from the subject matter. Please trust me, I will bring it back, and I will tie it back. But I want to talk about my journey in two regards, I guess. The first regard being, I've never really thought what makes one of those programs before. One of those programs where you are feeling like you're involved in more than just a piece of work, where it becomes something you so fully embed with, so fully sync with, that it becomes something almost akin to your identity for the period that you're engaged in that piece of work. A work hard, play hard mentality, perhaps a siege mentality, an us against the world mentality. When you look across the desk or across the Zoom meeting, you're not just seeing colleagues and friends, you're seeing brothers and sisters in arms. And I've been lucky enough to have a few of those programs in my time. I think back to a time at RBS when I was running a SME business-to-business social media proposition way back in 2011, and we were the group of digital hippies in an office where others were working on quite serious, straight-laced financial propositions. I think back to my previous program at BT, being stuck out in a godforsaken outpost, an old telephone exchange, which was literally rat-infested and nothing worked. But we made it into something because we had strong belief in what we did, and we had the right people involved. And latterly, the program that I'm involved in now, the mobile program. So I work for BT, and BT own Everything Everywhere, or eMobile as it's better known. Working on that program at the moment, we've found ourselves in one of those programs. And I've never really thought about what makes one of those programs before I embarked upon this journey. I'm just grateful for having had the opportunity to work on a few of them. But to add greater context, I've been on a personal journey over the last couple of years. A personal journey which has really made me understand the meaning of connection, I would say. And without wishing to turn this into a therapy session or a sob story, I have had significant mental health challenges in the timescale of the last couple of years. I am perhaps your stereotypical late 30s, early 40s, recent divorcee, oh my God, what does it all mean now kind of case study. A case study which is often prone to instances of depression or mental health difficulties, and I'm no different. And those mental health issues or those feelings of lack of connection really came to a head towards the end of 2019, when, in quite a desperate state, I was ready to end things. I'd planned the day, I'd planned the methods, I knew what I was going to do, but due to some very good and present friends, one of which is on this call, by the way, I'm still here. I'm still here. I live to fight another day, lots of good therapy, and a heck of a lot of focus on self-development after that point, which began with research. I wanted to understand, okay, if I'm prone to depression, I want to understand this black dog, as it's colloquially known, and I want to understand this beast. And the research I did was pretty wide-ranging, but the bit that perhaps chimed the most with me was the idea of trying to understand how somebody's environment, somebody's external factors can potentially lead to depression. And the word that came up again and again and again was connection. And the work of an author called Johann Hari particularly interested me, a book called Lost Connections, where Johann Hari talks at some length about what makes a healthy human condition. And he will talk about connection to a secure and stable future, connection to other people, connection to nature, connection to meaningful work, connection to a sense of self. And when I looked at myself, I realized how many of those connections I was missing when I was hurtling towards that literal cliff edge. And shortly after this research happened, COVID happened and lockdown happened. And that was very much a blessing in disguise for me. Against the backdrop of tragedy and difficulty for loved ones around me, if I was to be really blinkered and selfish about it, I've emerged from lockdown perhaps in a much better state than when I went in, because it gave me the opportunity to forge these connections, to spend time in nature, to invest in a small number of meaningful friendships and connections, to invest in creativity, play the guitar, draw, whatever it might be, to invest in finding and then hopefully sharing a sense of purpose. So that path to personal connection really brought me back from the edge. And the reason I've talked about it is it somewhat shaped my approach to work and certainly my approach to the challenges that certainly late 2020 brought. And the day of revelation, without wishing to sound too dramatic, came on my birthday in October last year. And my birthday coincided with the UK government announcing yet another level of restrictions for another level of the country. I can't remember whether it was tier 3 or tier 4. I can't remember whether it was for London, where I live, or Manchester, where I'm from. But it sparked something in me. And the thought that it sparked in me was, oh my God, if I'd have been going through my worst times during COVID, during tier 4 or tier 3 or whatever it was being announced, would I have made it? Which was a sobering enough thought as it was. But there I am as the technology lead for a program of 150 people. And I've become very familiar with the statistics around mental health and suicide. And the horrific thought that struck me was, you know what, Feroz, there is probably a proportion of your team right now who are either where you were or not far from where you were. And there's a real risk that somebody might die on my watch. That might sound a wee bit sensational, but the statistics would suggest otherwise. And that's certainly how I felt. So I engaged with a number of people at BT, including Craig, who's on this call, including some senior leadership, with some ideas about how we create a culture of safety, how we create a program where people are able to not only survive, but thrive and enjoy a feeling of connection. And the desired outcomes I was looking for, the desired outcomes we were looking for, was for a team that was encouraged to look after themselves and each other, particularly look after themselves and know their boundaries. A team that was encouraged to be their authentic selves at work, not feeling that they need to code switch or hide any of what they are. They could safely bring it into a workplace. A team that would be encouraged and enabled to connect, collaborate. A team that felt part of something special and meaningful. And rather crucially, a team that felt invested in and cared for. Now, when I talk about those 5 themes, I could probably express them another way. I could probably express them in terms of boundaries, people being encouraged to look after themselves, people knowing and expressing themselves, people being part of a community, people having a purpose, and the introduction of compassion and love into the way we behave in the workplace. And for anybody who's been on any kind of spiritual journey as I have, they will recognize how firmly that dovetails into a lot of spiritual, religious teachings, well-being teachings, etc., etc. I don't think that's a coincidence. So we had our desired outcomes. We knew what we wanted to achieve. How are we going to do it? And again, there's a few key points here, and I will get to the virtual office soon, I promise you. But the approaches were for us as a leadership team, maybe a small number of 3 or 4 people, to themselves lead by example and be authentic, be transparent, be human, be prepared to show vulnerability as leaders working with this fantastic team. We wanted to celebrate and laugh together. We wanted, in those months and months of darkness, literal and metaphorical, to be a place where people could be educated and informed, where people could be connected, where we were, as a leadership team, will double down on the idea of servant leadership, because we knew we had all the talent we needed to deliver around us. And one of the key vehicles with which we could enable this was the virtual office. And I'll come on to why I've put virtual office at the bottom of the list in a short while. But I just want to take you on a very quick guided tour. Give me 2 seconds and I will share my screen, and I'll ask John just to give me the nod to confirm that he can see it. Yeah, cool. Thank you, John. This is the mobile virtual office. It's built on Google Sites, and the idea here was to provide, well, I tried to get the term remote co-location to take off, and it never really did. But the idea was to provide, 1, shared spaces where teams and squads could collaborate. So as for instance, if I drop down into my squad offices and I maybe peek into the Enterprise Managed Mobility office, which they have decorated themselves, you'll see they have 3 areas where they can go and collaborate and coexist. And they have some standing meetings, and they'll use these offices either on a consistent basis or on designated afternoons or mornings. It's office time. We're going to have some together time as teams in these areas. Every squad has those 3 areas. Every squad decorates its own space a wee bit differently. The migrations team are somewhat obsessed with the Avengers, I seem to remember. We also decided to take it 1 step further. Again, in those months of darkness over the winter, we provided a pub, which we referred to, being a mobile tribe, as the phone and dongle, where we ran Desert Island Discs nights, which are still going. We ran pub quizzes. And also we just got into the culture of people nipping into the phone and dongle for half an hour after work for a Swiftie, to unload, to connect, to really get to know each other as more than just names on a screen at the bottom of a picture on a Zoom call. We invested in special events on that crusade of inform and educate, and you can see some of them which are recorded here from both within and without BC. And we encouraged thoughts around bringing your whole self into work, whether that be diversity issues such as International Women's Day, or reflecting on where we feel we are, George Floyd, 1 year on. We also built some wellbeing studios where I run 4 times weekly meditations. We've had other people running Keep Fit classes in here over those dark, cold months between October and March. And we've tried to really create, whether people want to use them or not, they know they are there. They know they have a place to go and be with, collaborate with, innovate with, be off the cuff with their teams. They know there's a place where they can let their hair down and have a drink, and be their complete selves. They know there's a place where they can come for spiritual or well-being guidance. They know there are gathering points where we're going to run our team and tribe demos from every couple of weeks. And they know they've got a leadership team who are invested in bringing in people who hopefully can develop. All that lies behind these meetings here, these are our various coffee tables, are Teams meetings. I'm not on my works laptop at the moment, but if I was to show you my works laptop calendar entry for the 31st of October, all you'd see are about 100 Teams meetings. And each one of these links to that Teams meetings, which is effectively on perpetually. So all this virtual office is, very simply, is a Google site skin over a bunch of Teams meetings. It might as well be Zoom meetings or Google Meets. It would work in exactly the same way. And I'm pretty pleased with what we managed to achieve. We, as a program, in fairly short order through the height of the pandemic, had by far and away the best engagement scores, the best survey scores of the people who work with us on our program. We actually delivered some really, really good stuff over the height of COVID. We retained our productivity, innovation. We ran countless hackathons. And at a time when BT is, as all big companies tend to do from time to time, revisiting its operating model and the structure of its programs, they've decided to leave us well alone because they acknowledge we've got something special. And that something special, I think, is also acknowledged, is built on creating that culture of safety and being really invested in it. So the point, as I mentioned earlier, if you were on the call before I got started, programs across BT are now starting to call me and say, Feroz, we want some of that. We want some of that secret sauce. And I'm assisting half a dozen or more big programs with creating their own virtual office spaces. And I'm in conversations with BT Technology about how we transfer it to a BT platform where we don't have to be so conscious perhaps of things like data issues, which we do have to be conscious of when we're working on Google site. So the outcomes were good. I'd like to think that anybody who's worked in our program over the last year and not only experienced the virtual office, but experienced the other approaches that I talked about, the authentic leadership, the determination to educate and inform, etc., etc. I'd like to think they've enjoyed it. I'd like to think there are things they'll take away from it as they rotate off on some other programs and seed elsewhere. And hopefully this idea of a culture of safety being central can propagate throughout the organization and who knows, maybe even beyond. But I do take some key conclusions from the experience of the last year or so. Conclusion number one, if it needed to be restated, but it's now firmer than ever, a team of people who are encouraged to be authentic, are allowed to connect, who are engaged in work that they believe is meaningful, can move mountains. I've no doubt about that at all. Some of the stuff we've achieved is mind-blowing. Conclusion number two, as leaders, culture, compassion, being prepared to be vulnerable, being prepared to use words like love and care on a day-to-day basis, has got to be in our DNA. It's got to be just part of the way we do things. It's not just a well-being coffee half hour once a week. It's not just, once every quarter or once every year, we'll get a life coach in to come talk to you. It's got to be the way that we do things. I don't have to ask my team to jump particularly high to get over a wall, because I have every faith that they'll run through it for me before I've even asked the question. And that's because as a leadership team, we've brought that culture of compassion and care and enablement and servant leadership to the way we do things. Conclusion number three, technology isn't the silver bullet. The virtual office isn't the silver bullet. The virtual office is an enabler. But you could drop that virtual office into an environment and expect it to take off without being nurtured, without being promoted, without being worked on, and it would fail. The virtual office works as an enabler, almost as byproducts, a technology byproduct of all the principles I talked about earlier: authentic leadership, celebrating and laughing together, connecting people, etc., etc. With imagination and buy-in, something like the virtual office, imaginative use of technology, can be a huge enabler. And it doesn't have to be incredibly complex and full of integrations and APIs and every other technology acronym you can possibly imagine. My final conclusion, which is a personal one, and then I'll stop, I promise you, is what the last year has shown me following my journey, is that not only can I bring all of me into the way I lead, but I am a better leader when I do bring all of me into the way that I choose to lead. which is massively impactful for me personally. And I think I'm probably not alone in feeling that over the last year and with these experiments that we've embarked upon in our time PT. I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening. Sorry it was a wee bit of a meandering path. I'd happily take questions, thoughts, discussion.
Not sure about everyone else, but thank you for sharing that, Feroz. That was incredibly powerful. And if anyone has questions and feeling a bit camera shy, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll read them out for you. But one that I actually had was just around the, sort of the day one. Like, was this something that you emerged and evolved over time, the virtual office, or was it something where you had a fairly clear vision and you build it and then everyone came and co-located around it?
So I had the spark on that day of revelation, my birthday last year. I was actually due to be off work the week after when the next sprint review was going to be with the tribe. So I recorded a video on that day when I'd had the idea, and I built a very, very quick proof of concept to sell the idea of, let's do a virtual office, but let's not only do a virtual office, let's bring these fundamentals into the way we work, the way we lead, the way we treat each other. And Craig, I think you were at the meeting that I missed because I was away on holiday, but I'm told it was, exceptionally well received. I was very open about my story. And when I got back, I literally had volunteers banging down my door to say, yeah, Feroz, we want to build this with you. Now, I won't lie, uptake is variable across my squads. Some squads embrace it wholeheartedly. Some squads will maybe do a virtual office day here, a virtual office morning there. And some squads might only do their ceremonies in there or pop in there and use it as an always-on meeting space at their own convenience. But I would go back to, people know it's there. People know they've got a leadership team who are invested in making their working lives a wee bit better. So even if they're not devout users of it and perhaps achieving some of the productivity benefits, which I've no doubt are there, they still have that safety net of feeling part of a team that cares and invests in them. But yes, the idea of the virtual office was there on minute one, and I built the prototype, which was demoed in my absence. And when I got back off holiday, we set about building it. And a couple of weeks later, we were up and running. I mean, Craig, I'm not sure what your recollections were at the time.
I mean, it just seemed to come together really quickly as an effective platform, but then it grew, right? Because then there was other stuff happening. There was the pub events, there was, teams came and went and they built their own spaces. But then there was the big pivot of saying, let's just hang out in the virtual office and have that open time in which people are actively collaborating together, even to the remote. So it wasn't like a meeting, it was just, we're all in the same space together working. So it was like creating the platform, then it opened up opportunities for other things.
That's awesome.
Hi, it's Askold. Sorry, Feroz, I think it would be worthwhile mentioning how the senior leadership team got introduced to the idea and their reaction.
Yeah, I can do. Thanks, Askold. So the day that I recorded that video on the day of revelation, back on my birthday last year, I have a good friend who works into the MD of Transformation and Enterprise, and I asked him to review the video because I'd obviously shared about my journey, and I was like saying, do you think this is too much, mate? Can you give me a bit of a peer review on this video that I've recorded for my tribe review next week? And his reaction straight away was, can you share this with Joanna? Joanna being the MD of Transformation. And I did share it with Joanna, and that video went somewhat viral. And back in October, November, lots and lots of pats on the back, lots and lots of, yeah, I love what you're doing. Lots and lots of, we want to do this at an enterprise level. But then I'll take you back to what I said before. As leaders, culture and compassion has got to be in our DNA. It's not an optional extra. And when those senior leaders got very, very busy, the idea of, yeah, let's get Feroz into our team meeting so we can talk more about this and we can have a bit of the same, tended to fall off the agenda a wee bit, which is understandable. We're in the middle of COVID. We're trying to, these senior guys have got a hell of a lot on their plates. And I'd say it probably took a period of months once they saw the performance and the morale and the well-being in our tribe for people to actually come back to me and say, actually, really sorry. I know I said we'd speak about this months ago. Can we speak about it now? So double-edged sword, Ascot. There was no doubt a lot of endorsement and enthusiasm of what we did back in October. I think because as yet we're still on that path of putting compassion and love and culture into our DNA, there wasn't the initial uptake that potentially there could have been. But that is starting to be righted now, and we have virtual offices popping up all over the place.
We've just got a couple of questions in the chat from RK. Thank you, Feroz, for sharing your story. I'm in NYC and I had to leave my job earlier this month due to a toxic workplace. Apologies for that. Okay, that sounds pretty terrible. I have two questions for you. One, every employer promotes their amazing culture, but when you get in, that's not the case. How do you find out about whether or not they say is true? And two, as a leader, would you give opportunities to get someone on board who's coming from a different background, for example, someone who comes from property management to work on your team?
Wow, okay. Well, let's start with number one. I mean, yeah, I think I think it's very fashionable now for companies to use the word culture and put it front and center of the way they try to recruit, without necessarily, as I keep making the point, having that idea of compassion and culture in their DNA. I'm a freelancer. Although I've been at BT for a wee while, I move around quite a lot. But I always try and make sure that I've spoken to a few people within the organization, ideally within the area that I'm being scouted for, to get perhaps an informal view of the culture. There's also a key point here, which is going a wee bit away from the subject matter, but it's worth making, okay? That an interview is not only an opportunity for the interviewer to ask you things, it's an opportunity for the interviewee to ask the interviewer and ask them key questions about their culture, and perhaps ask them directly what they see as the key components of their culture, how perhaps that company differs in looking after its workforce to other companies, how it generates a culture of safety. I think all too often the interview is a wasted opportunity for the prospective employee to actually drill down and get some of that information at the point of interview. So contacting and networking within the organization, utilizing the interview. Second question, giving opportunities to people who come from a different background. Absolutely. As a freelancer, I've enjoyed moving around from telecoms to banking to the health service. And the first time I've gone into those industries, I was reliant on somebody giving me an opportunity. And I'm very, very grateful for those opportunities. What I've found is that when you do take somebody from a different industry, they bring a very different viewpoint. They bring a very different lens onto particularly matters of culture, what works, what doesn't, what motivates. In financial services, there was a very much win-lose culture. In telecoms, I find it's very much more a win-win culture. In the health service, it's very much an altruistic culture. And there's bits we can pluck from around that to help develop ourselves as potential products and people. I would be, all too often, especially when I think there's a recruitment person between the prospective employed and the prospective employer, that opportunity to recruit from different backgrounds perhaps gets eradicated because a recruitment person or agent would say must have such and such experience. Again, I think networking is the answer to getting around that barrier. When I joined BT, you needed to be a graduate. I'm not a graduate. You needed to have fixed line telephony experience. I didn't, but I knew guys within BT who knew what I was capable of, and I was able to get in that side door. Hopefully that helps, Darky.
Fantastic. Were there any other questions?
Hey, it's Henson here. Hi, Faraz.
And
First of all, what a wonderful story. I've been I guess friend of multiple people who've unfortunately had the unpleasant experience of having people take their own lives in their family. So I'm really glad that you take the real kind of positive kind of out of it. And one of the key things they always say is, it's not the people who pass away, it's the people they leave behind. It's the hardest. So I'm glad you took the right approach there. Really glad. A quick question around the approach for the virtual office. I'm really keen on just understanding almost like a day in the life of what that's like with the people who use it. And I guess the reason I asked that is my team recently kind of went through almost a similar journey where a trust was a huge issue. It's almost it's almost granted sometimes where management just says, hey, we work in a trusted environment. And it's just like, okay, well, what have you actually done to demonstrate that trust? And it's not there. So when we actually talk about that in the retrospectives among ourselves, it's just not there. There's key distinction between what the squad feels and how they feel about management. And so what they decided to do was actually block out time in their day through MS Teams, and where they say no one's allowed to be in there except for engineers, and they will make themselves available among themselves to collaborate, to talk, to vent. But what came out of it is a 100% element of trust that they are able to deliver what they commit to for each sprint. I'm just curious whether the virtual space that you have is somewhat similar to what that experience is like for my squad. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Great question, Vincent. Thank you. And thank you for your kind words. Yes, absolutely. The virtual office is there as an enabler to create that opportunity to be in a shared space without the formality of a meeting. And it sounds like you've created something very similar in putting aside that time for your team to bond, develop those connections. Trust is a byproduct of connection in my book. So hopefully they have connected a wee bit more as people and learn to establish that respect, and from that respect comes trust. But no, the principle is very, very similar. We've created that area where they can come in and get on with work without necessarily feeling that they are particularly time constrained or having to work to somebody else's rules or agenda. The way we started in the virtual office was to say, right, all ceremonies in the virtual office from now on. And the stand-up is usually the start of most people's days. And we started by encouraging people, well, why don't you drop into your office for 10, 15 minutes before you stand up? Say hello, get to know each other. We'd heard horror stories of people joining us in May, June 2020 who'd never had a social conversation with any of their colleagues by the time it came to October. How heartbreaking is that? So that was the initial encouragement. Start with your ceremonies, and then where you believe it appropriate, look to carve out time. And as that kind of grew and flourished, and it had its peaks and its troughs, we then introduced virtual office Tuesday. And on Tuesday mornings, no meetings go in the diary. The teams exist in their various virtual offices. And yet that has great benefit, both in terms of, connection and trust. I'll tell you what other benefit it doesn't have, which I didn't mention that perhaps I should have mentioned. We have 10, 11 squads in our tribe, and they're all working on slightly different things. These guys are working on automation. These guys are working on service processes. You've got your leadership team. They're actually able, in a virtual office environment, to say, crikey, I really wish I could speak to Brian in the migrations team to understand the approach here. They can go into the migrations office, say, Brian, can we grab you for 5 minutes? Just like we would have done in a co-load office. So where you've got multiple squads who might have dependencies in each other, it brought that benefit as well. And it kind of snowballed from there. And like I say, some teams 100% engaged, spend every minute they can in the virtual office. Some teams less so. But yeah, that's kind of where it started, and with very, very similar principles and foundations that you started from.
Thank you so much for it. Really appreciate it.
No worries. John, just in case it's useful, I'm going to drop my email address in the chat. And if anybody has any questions afterwards, or if anybody necessarily has any thoughts that they perhaps weren't comfortable sharing in front of strangers that might relate to the mental health section of my chat, or if they want to see under the hood of the virtual office or how easy it is to build, because it is damn easy, just drop me a line.
And if you're comfortable, Fairose, I'd also like to share the recording of this with the meetup event itself. So for those that weren't able to make it, they can catch up.
Awesome.
Look
Of
as well.
course. No problem.
Awesome. All right. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that so much. It was a really powerful story, and it was quite a bold thing to share that with us so openly, and also all the amazing things that came out of it.
No, it's been a pleasure. It's been lovely talking to you all.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. I'll end the recording and wrap things up here. And yeah, certainly reach out to Fairose for all things virtual office. It sounds like it's quite the start of a beautiful journey for the folks at BT.
Thanks, everyone.